Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Martinez. I am one of the Education USA advisors for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Thank you so much for joining us for the third in our series of regional Education USA webinars aimed at students in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. This evening, we'll be having a presentation led by Deputy Public Affairs Officer Leland Lazarus at the U.S. Embassy Bridgetown on U.S. culture and values. Just a few weeks ago, we began our series of regional webinars for students in our region with the aim of providing more targeted sessions on topics that we thought were of particular interest to our students. We began our conversation with 2 sessions on step 1, researching your options, particularly looking at a checklist for success for undergraduate students, and highlighting 5 states not particularly chosen by students in our region, and taking us on a bit of a road trip. You can find those 2 videos on Education USA Guatemala's Facebook page, and I encourage students, if you are now beginning your process and looking for US colleges and universities that might be the best fit for you, to go back and take a look at those videos on Education USA Guatemala's Facebook page. This evening, we're jumping forward a few steps in Education USA's 5 Steps to US Study with our presentation on US culture and values, which technically falls under step 5, preparing for your departure. We are very excited to prepare you guys to travel to the United States. We understand that this is a time of great uncertainty for many students due to the health and safety restrictions and sometimes travel restrictions being placed on you by your home countries. But we do want to provide you with information on, the cultural and academic adjustments you will have to make if you begin your studies in the United States this fall. We are really pleased to team up with U.S. Embassy Bridgetown for this presentation and really excited to have Leland here to walk us through. This evening, we are going to be looking at a little bit about what Education USA is, the services we offer, how we can assist students within our region with their higher education goals. We'll highlight some upcoming virtual events, and then we'll launch right into the presentation that Leland has for us this evening, looking at American cultural diversity, the current U.S. socio-political situation, U.S. law and international students, and U.S. academic culture. We'll wrap up today with a Q&A where Leland will take the questions that we're asking you guys to submit via the comments section below, and we'll be highlighting that throughout the presentation today. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and so we encourage you to take advantage and to ask your questions, to make your comments, and we'll have some questions and surveys for you as well throughout. So we really want you to take advantage of this presentation today. We would like to kick things off with our first survey question, and you can go ahead and respond to this throughout the duration. And it's really for us to see where you're joining us from. We have a very big region that we are engaging with today. Close to 50 advising centers within our NACAC region, as we call it. And we want to hear where you're joining us from. So if you could take the time to write in the comments below either your country or the region, whether that be North America, Central America, or the Caribbean, or perhaps you're joining us from outside of this region, to let us know where you're connecting with us from this evening. We would really be appreciative. We want to see good representation from throughout our region. So a little bit about Education USA. We are a network of international student advising centers. We have more than 430 advising centers in just over 170 countries. We have dedicated advisors in these advising centers who are there to be your official source on US higher education. We offer accurate, comprehensive, and current information on the US higher education system, as well as the admissions process. And our job is to assist students in navigating through this process. We guide students through what we call our 5 steps to US study, specifically looking first at researching your options, As I mentioned before, we've had 2 great webinars thus far on that topic. So I encourage you to go back to Education USA Guatemala and check those out on their Facebook page. And then we go into financing your options, financing your studies. That's step 2. We then look at step 3, which is completing your application, and step 4, applying for your student visa, and where we are today, step 5, preparing for your departure. As previously mentioned, this is pre-departure season for us here at Education USA, and we understand that many of you might be beginning your new academic year in a fashion that you didn't really see yourself beginning it in when you were applying to colleges and universities. And we want to let you know that we are a resource here for you, to support you as you transition to your next chapter. What's next for us as Education USA Regional Webinar Series? On Wednesday, July 8th, we'll be hosting our next session led by my colleague, Maria Luisa at Education USA Guatemala on pathway programs. We're very excited to welcome 3 guest speakers from 3 different universities in the United States that will be highlighting various pathway programs international students can take to the US higher education system. And next week, I know this is a session that many of you will be very excited about. These are 2 sessions, the first of which is for undergraduate students, and the second of which is for graduate students on, am I a good candidate for financial aid? These will be led by my colleague Jackson Cruz at Education USA Nicaragua. So I strongly encourage you to stay tuned for updates on those sessions by following your Education USA advising centers on social media, as well as your US Embassy on social media. Or you can visit us on educationusa.state.gov to get more information on all of these webinars and activities and events that we have planned for you. With that being said, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn this presentation over to Leland. Before I do so, I would like to let you guys know that we have a Google form that we're asking you to complete if you have time, just to let us know a little bit more information about yourselves, your contact, email address, where you're joining us from, and if you would like to receive updates on future advising sessions and webinars. So without further ado, Leland, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and for our colleagues and our viewers in Central America, and this evening here in the Caribbean. I turn this over to you.
Amanda, thank you so much. And to the students who are tuning in, I want to thank you guys for choosing the United States to study abroad. And for the parents who are tuning in, thank you for entrusting us with your son or daughter. Again, for the students, you could have gone anywhere else in the world, and yet you chose to study in the United States. And I think it is and will be a life-changing experience. Like what Amanda was saying before, we are living in such odd times. And so we don't necessarily know when you'll be going, but doing programs like these will definitely better prepare you for your incredible journey to the United States soon. And before I really even get started, I also want to thank all of the Education USA advisors throughout Latin America. Yourself, Amanda, so many of your other colleagues for sharing the story about the United States and providing these opportunities for such bright students. So thank you so much. All right, so I want to make this as interactive as possible. And so I see that some people are already posting about where you're from. So thank you so much, Ann Hamilton, Doffwell, you're from the Caribbean, Sherry Ann, Shay Charles from Antigua, Judith from Suriname, Shana from New Jersey. Okay, New Jersey. I'm from New York. And Granville McSheen from St. Kitts. My name is Leland Lazarus. I'm the Deputy Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. I'm originally from New York. I went to undergrad at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And then I did my graduate school at Tufts University. But I sort of feel the same feeling that you guys must have of going abroad, studying abroad. I've actually studied abroad in Latin America, but also in China as well. I'm Panamanian American, so for the Latinos out there too, I feel a affinity with you guys as well. So to get started, let's first identify what are some characteristics that you think define the United States and Americans in general. If you had to think of one word, you can type this out. Type it out. What are some characteristics that you think define the United States and Americans? I'm going to give you some time. All right. I see some Education USA advisors from Santo Domingo, from El Salvador. Thank you so much for joining. Anybody want to? There's Education USA from St. Lucia, Melissa. Anybody want to take a guess on or want to talk about some of those characteristics? Freedom, yes. Thank you, Rosa. Responsibility, okay. All right. We also have Lindy here from Venezuela. How are you doing? Solidarity and dreams. Okay, nice. Okay. So the answer to that is it's some of those things, all of those things. And why do I say that? Because the U.S. is a big and super diverse place. I mean, we're talking about 330 million people, right? In a space that is about 4 million square miles. And so you're going to be seeing and hearing and meeting from people with so many different backgrounds, so many different viewpoints. And that is the diversity of the United States. And that's why it's hard to sort of say, what do Americans think about this? Or what do Americans think about that? Because the answer is you'll get 100 different answers. So one of the ways in which the United States is diverse is in its geography. So we have broken this up into sort of 5 different regions in the US. So I'm from the Northeast, that's the blue part, and that involves New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, DC, Maine, and those areas. Then you have the Southeast, Miami, rather Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, the Carolinas. Then you have the Southwest. That's big Texas. Everything is bigger in Texas. You've got New Mexico, Arizona. Then you have the Midwest up there in the green. That is Michigan. Actually, my wife is from Michigan, and she never ceases to tell me how awesome Michigan is. You will definitely see how people who are from a certain state definitely think that their state is the best. And so obviously, New York is the best state, obviously. I might be biased. And then you have the West, which encompasses California and Washington and Oregon. But there's another way to also think about this. I read an article from a newspaper called The Atlantic. And this is a little bit dated. It was an article in 2013. But the article basically breaks up the United States on 3 different personalities. So you've got the friendly and conventional group, and that is in sort of the Midwest area and also encompasses the South. And they explain that the friendly and conventional groups, they ended up being more traditional, they're more religious, they are more outgoing and friendly. So you always hear about Southern hospitality, and that when you're out in the streets, people will say, "Oh, good morning," and "How are you doing?" and so on and so forth. You can say that that's pretty much opposite of the Northeast, which is they call it the temperamental and uninhibited group. And what they mean by that is they tend to be liberal leaning. They tend to be, sort of left leaning. They tend to have a faster pace in life, and so for that reason, there's actually not that much time to sort of say hi and good morning and how are you doing, all those pleasantries. A lot of people skip those pleasantries, especially in New York City. And then you have the third group, which is out in the West, and they call those the relaxed and creative groups, and that's out sort of in California. And they tend to be more laid back. They also tend to be liberal leaning, and they tend to be super creative. And I think that has to do with the West's history. When you think about it, the West was settled by these individuals who were sort of pioneers, right? They left their homes and counties and whatnot in the East and walked all the way to the West to sort of start their own dreams, right? And that created that entrepreneurial spirit that to this day continues in California, Washington, and Oregon, and which is why we have Silicon Valley in California, right? And other areas like that.
And one thing I would just jump in here and say, Leland, as well, is that just last week we had presentations from 5 representatives of various state consortia in the U.S. And we specifically chose states that were, as I mentioned at the start of this webinar, that aren't typically chosen by our students from our region. We find that when students are applying to schools in the United States, they tend to choose some of the more popular states that maybe have large communities of people from their countries. I know from the case from Barbados in the Caribbean, we tend to frequent Florida and New York. We strategically chose states in each of these 5 geographic regions that are less popular to and that is exactly what the state consortia representatives talked about. They really described those personality types that you have described here. Specifically, the state representative from Minnesota, which is in that Midwest region, spoke extensively about Minnesota nice and the type of personalities that you're going to encounter in the Midwest generally. So I would encourage students to go back and take a watch of that on the Education USA Guatemala Facebook page and soon the Education USA Global site to see a little bit more about those personality types and the culture specific to those geographic regions that you mentioned.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any questions along the way, just type it right there in Facebook comments. We can all see it, and we'll both seek to answer those questions that you might have.
Definitely.
All right. Well, another way in which the United States is diverse is in its political views. I sort of alluded to it in the previous slide that some of the regions, say in the Northeast and also in the West, tend to be left-leaning. They tend to be liberal. And you can say that they are blue states because the Democratic Party in the United States, of course, is correlated with the color blue. And then the states in the Midwest and the South tend to be conservative. They tend to be red states. They tend to be Republican. They tend to vote Republican. But what's interesting is that there are actually some states in the United States that are considered purple states, or another word for that is swing state. That means that in one presidential election or another, they might actually vote either Democrat or Republican, right? And so they actually become super important when the presidential election comes around. And of course, our next presidential election is November 3rd, 2020. So a little bit less than 4 months away. I wanted to say that some of the important swing states are Ohio, which is highlighted in red right there. Also Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida. Florida is a really, really important swing state as well. I remember that the 2000 election was more or less chosen or decided based on the number of electors in Florida. which allowed sort of George W. Bush to win. So it's just another example of how important some of those swing states are. I don't know which universities you guys are going to be going to and which states. If you want to let us know, please write your comment, sort of which university you're going to, where it is, what you know about that place and that state. But I would encourage you to look to see whether the state in which your university is in is going to be leaning liberal or conservative. And I also encourage you on campus, get into the political discussion. Ask other Americans what they believe. Ask them why they believe it, and things like that. But I told Amanda this, that my college at Brown University, it's in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is actually a very, very, say, blue state. And Brown University was a very, very liberal university. And so it was actually kind of hard for someone who had conservative views to sort of talk about that there. So it's just interesting to sort of figure out what are the political leanings of the university that you're going to be at.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Leland. And just to counter that, I went to a large public research university, and there was a diversity of opinion on campus, political opinion. And so you would see, and that's definitely something that we would encourage you to take advantage of, not only to just listen to presentations that may have the same political ideology of you, but to listen to counter presentations or counter points and things like that, so that you become better informed of the issues. You're going to be living in the United States, so it's important for you to stay informed on the issues. It's a big election year, so you should know. And so take advantage when you're on campus of those events that different organizations may be hosting, that your college or your university may be hosting, to view and become part of the political process in that way by staying informed. And I think that's sort of a fundamental tenet of a democratic society is freely accessing information. So taking advantage of that on campus is really important. And that's something I did when I was in undergrad as well. I took advantage of those political events to just become better informed of what was going on in the United States.
Absolutely. Now, we absolutely cannot go forward without talking about the elephant in the room, which are the current socio-political issues going on in the United States, right? I mean, we are literally living through two major historical events, right? They're going to be talking in the history books about the great pandemic of 2020, right? And just like they talked about the great influenza of 1918. But they're also going to be talking about the massive protests that have been going on after the death of George Floyd, in the same way that we learn about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It's an incredible opportunity to sort of be living in this moment, right? As a African-American man, I realized that, yes, racism is a tough issue in the United States. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But I read an interesting op-ed in the New York Times a couple of days ago by a writer by the name of Nicole Hannah-Jones. And she brought up something that was really interesting. And she said, a truly great country does not ignore or excuse its sins. It confronts them and then works to make them right. And so when I see what's going on the streets in Minneapolis and New York and LA and Miami, I see hope. I'm hopeful because young people like me and younger are, first of all, they're exercising their constitutional rights for freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But second, they are holding their leaders accountable, and in order to really make change, right? And to have the United States really live up to those ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so when you guys go to the US, you will more or less be in that mix. And so again, it goes back to what Amanda and I were talking about before, just getting involved in sort of the political issues, just to learn more about it, to ask Americans about what they believe, why they believe it, what in their background has caused them to believe one thing or the other. I think that is really a great way in order to get involved in American society, get involved with and learn more about U.S. culture. One more thing I wanted to talk about this before we go on is I'm very hopeful for the fact that, yes, a lot of young people are out there protesting, but they've also inspired people around the world to also protest in their own countries, to really reflect on racial injustice, not only in the United States, but also in their own countries, which is absolutely incredible. I mean, you're seeing the protests that are happening also in London and Seoul, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan, and Australia, and even in Barbados. So it really is an incredible, incredible time. And it really is incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think one thing that our students should know when they're preparing to travel to the United States is that a lot of these activities, whether that be political in nature, might be occurring on university campuses. It's going to be, as Leland mentioned, this movement is being led by young people, Leland's age and younger. It's your generation that will largely be leading these movements. So we encourage you to get involved, to safely and to legally exercise your rights to participate in the political process. So I do think that's an important point that you've noted here, Leland, about the current socio-political situation in the United States and the sort of ripple effect that it's had on the global community. I know now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the laws in the United States that might impact students. And what we're going to do here is we're going to put another sort of question out there to the audience who are watching. And this is a pretty easy one, which is, what is the legal drinking age in the United States? What is the legal drinking age in the United States? And I think, this is something that throughout our regions, it varies country by country. But in the US, it's pretty strict about what the legal drinking age is. So I don't know if we see any responses in the questions below, in the comments below.
Not yet.
But for the sake of time, we're going to go on. And Leland, why don't you answer what the legal drinking age is in the United States?
Oh, we got some people here. Okay. Someone says 21. Ann Hamilton says 21.
Mm-hmm.
USA Mexico City says 21.
I think we have consensus there. Indeed, 21. Go ahead, Leland, take it away.
Yes. So the drinking age is 21 years old. The smoking age is 18 years old. In terms of legalized substances like marijuana, marijuana is still illegal on a federal level, but some states have legalized it. I know that a lot of people know, for example, that Colorado has legalized marijuana. But I do want to stress that as international students studying in the United States, you are bound by federal law. And so just to make sure that you keep that in mind when you guys are eventually in the US and partying and whatnot, so just keep that in mind. You are subject to federal law.
Yeah, and I think the reason for highlighting these differences is that these are differences from many of our home countries as it relates to the legal limits, the ages that you must be to purchase, to consume, and possess these substances. And we really just want to make you aware of these points because we want to make sure that you are keeping your status when you're in the United States as a student visa holder and not doing anything to put that in jeopardy, whether that be, your academic status at your university, which is tied to your visa status. So just making you well aware that, to smoke, you need to be 18 years old, and to drink, you need to be 21. And many restaurants and bars, I'm sure if you've traveled to the United States, you've seen this before. It sometimes doesn't matter how you look, how young or how old you look. Many establishments will ask for photo ID, and you need to have that prepared to give to them to prove your age as well. All right, so now we're getting into some of the more social aspects of the United States, and we're getting into some tips, no pun intended there. So I think this is another question for the audience here. In the United States, it is customary to tip what percentage at a restaurant? And I do notice that this is a difference, from many regions and the US, where a lot of the time service charge in the Caribbean is already included in our bill. So we don't think about tipping outside of that, but this is a big cultural practice in the United States. So if you could go ahead and write in the comments, what is the appropriate percentage to tip at a restaurant?
Yeah, is it 5 to 15%, 15 to 25%, or 25 to 40%? We got one vote for 5 to 15.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
Leland, what do you think it is?
I'm going for 15 to 25%.
You'd be right. It is 15 to 25% customarily. All right, Leland. So you want to give us an overview of some of these topics here in American cultural practices?
Sure. Well, one more thing I wanted to say about sort of tipping and everything like that is the minimum wage in different states it varies, and so some people who work in the restaurants, I mean, they are really dependent on those tips as a way to really get by in life, right? So not paying those tips is really just not good. Really is not good, and is actually sort of disrespectful to that person who's really relying on those tips in order to get by.
I think that's an excellent point. And just jumping ahead to this tipping part of it, it's not just in the restaurant industry. I think, many of us would know that we need to tip at a restaurant, especially a sit-down restaurant. But there are other areas that it's customary to tip in the United States. Get out of a taxi cab, it's sometimes customary to just sort of round up and add a little extra tip on there. If you're going to stay at a hotel, sometimes it's customary to leave tip there for the service that you receive, whether that be cleaning service or bellhops, things like that. I know if you're going to a hair salon or barber shop, it's customary to tip in those scenarios as well. So it's important to know the various sectors that it is appropriate to tip and what the percentage is there. Because as Leland mentioned, sometimes it's very disrespectful not to tip, as this is how a lot of people subsidize their earnings.
We've got Michael Moret right here saying, as a former waiter, I approve that message. Yeah. I'm glad we got you, Michael. And then there was another question about sometimes when dining with a group of friends, is it already included?
Yeah. Sometimes, right? If it's in a group over a certain amount of people. And that's something you would have to see, Leland, right, on a restaurant by restaurant basis. And they often include that information in the menu to let you know if the bill can be split into multiple, among multiple customers, and how they will be handling tipping. Some people will tell you that tip is not included, but for large groups, sometimes, yes, it will be included. And it's up to you if, if your particular server went above and beyond to make your dining experience feel really, warm and pleasurable and, great, if you want to add tip on top of that. But you guys have to also recognize what your budget is, to bear that in mind. Would you agree, Leland?
I agree. I also find that my wife and I live in Miami now, and I think Miami's because there are so many. There's such an international population that a lot of the restaurants end up putting tip in, including tip anyway, or they'll have in the receipt the sort of three options, like the 15%, the 22%, and 25% already there calculated for you. So it just increases the ease with which you can give tips.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Now, I know number one on this list is a big point for many students in our region, punctuality. What do you have to say about that, Leland?
Well, I have been working in the Caribbean for almost a year now. Again, my parents come from Panama, and so I know that there's island time, there's a little bit of Latin America time, which is like, hey, if something starts at 2 p.m., well, maybe it really starts at 2:15 or really starts at 2:30. In the U.S., especially in the academic and professional environment, punctuality is key. And making sure to be on time for those events or for class is super important. So I would suggest that whether it be for your class in school or if you're going for an interview, for an internship, or for your first job or anything like that, to just arrive maybe 5-10 minutes early to the place, just so that you make sure that you really are on time.
Exactly. I would echo that, and I would say comparatively, because I am a Bayesian and I work in an American setting, Americans tend to be very punctual people. So even if you are not in a professional setting, if you have American friends, as I did when I studied in the United States, they tend to be very punctual, and it's a sign of respect as well, just showing up on time and doing your best to be there on time when you say you are. So I would just echo your sentiment that yes, punctuality is sometimes a challenge for us Caribbean folk and to friends in Latin America as well, but it is something that Americans definitely practice, punctuality. Formality, Leland. So how would you refer to people in a professional setting, in a classroom? What is the exchange like?
So especially in the academic setting, you just call your professors Professor so-and-so, right? Until they decide or say, hey, no, you can call me by my first name or different name or whatnot. And so I would always err on being more formal than less formal.
Definitely. I think it is it's based on the relationship that you have, and the tone that's definitely set in that situation. When you're in a classroom or an academic setting, as you said, lecturers are going to ask you to refer to them usually by professor or doctor, and that is also a sign of respect. And that's something you want to remember, not just when you are engaging with people in person, but also when you're engaging with people online. When you are reaching out to your professors via email, you do want to keep it quite professional and making sure that you're referring to them by the appropriate titles and that you're signing things professionally as well, just as a sign of respect. Okay. As it relates to conversation culture, what is it like to engage with Americans in a setting? What is the personal space like? Things like that. and this is taken into account, the time that we're living in as well, right? With COVID-19 going on.
Absolutely. I mean, you can talk about, yeah, I mean, COVID-19, but you can also talk about like whether it be the, I feel as if, well, what's your point of view? What's your point of view?
Well, I do think what we need to know is Americans do appreciate personal space. This is something that we have to particularly keep in mind right now with COVID-19. What are the health and safety protocols that we all need to be practicing? But as it relates to actual conversation culture and topics that are appropriate and not appropriate to address, I had a former supervisor who told me there's certain things that you don't bring up in polite conversation until you get to know someone better. And that might be culturally different from what we do in our region. There's certain things like politics, religion, that you don't bring up on a first time basis. But what would you say are some of the tips that you would give international students about ways and things that are appropriate and not appropriate to bring up in conversation?
Yeah, I would agree that, especially someone that you just meet, to not then just say, well, why do you believe that? Why is your religion like that? Those kinds of like deep conversations, right? About either religion or politics. But as you get to know the person better, then you can definitely talk about those things. Another thing I wanted to sort of add is giving compliments to people, sometimes unwanted compliments. I know in Spanish we call it piropo, and there was actually like a law in Panama a couple of years ago that they put on called the anti-piropo law, being like basically men can't do catcalling for women, which is extremely important, right? Because we want to respect someone's wishes, right? So just making sure that you're not somehow demeaning someone else, or that a compliment that you think might be a compliment ends up actually being misconstrued or misunderstood and things like that.
I would completely agree. I think that's a really important point that you've made there about sort of the tone you use in conversation, the language as it relates to gender, as it relates to sex, as it relates to sexual orientation. These are things that are very important to highlight for students who are traveling to the United States. These are things that are taken very seriously in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to think before you speak, and to understand and appreciate the respect that you need to have for people who might hold different opinions or beliefs than your own. And I think you've raised a really important point there, Leland, as it relates to complimenting and catcalling. There are some cultural differences about what is appropriate in our region, or acceptable rather, in our region, versus what is and is not acceptable in the United States. And I think that's an important point that we'll be touching on in future webinars as well. I'm going into a little bit more detail about. And I think for you traveling over to the United States, when you get onto that college campus, there are many orientation sessions that you will have there on campus as well that will provide you with tips of things that are and are not appropriate to discuss on campus and with students and others that you may be meeting with, and sometimes what the repercussions are if you make people feel uncomfortable, or if they feel just uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Leland, this last point here that I have, public transportation best practices, I've included just because you come from New York, and this might be a little bit for students who are going to big cities,
Mm-hmm.
might be coming from smaller towns or islands or countries. And what are some of those public transportation best practices that students should be aware of when they're going over to the US?
Absolutely. And I think anybody tuning in who's from a big city in your own country, you'll feel this, or you'll sympathize with me about some of these things, which is usually some public transportation etiquette. A perfect example is when you're on an sort of elevator, either up or down. Usually to the right is if you stand, but to the left is people when they really want to move and sort of walk or even sort of jog up during rush hour when they really need to get someplace. It irks people, definitely in New York, definitely in Washington, D.C., when someone is sort of standing in the left side.
Now 1845 and that Chancery will be
Another thing too is, say you're on the train and you are standing sort of right near the doors. That's also really annoying. So just making sure that you're sort of off to the side, allowing people to sort of get off the train so that there's continued movement during this. Now, again, the whole coronavirus issue might actually make this whole point moot. But once things get back going again, we would definitely want to have you at least do some of those public transportation best practices.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Leland. And that's definitely something that, we have to adjust to as I can speak for myself when visiting sort of those larger cities, even though I would have lived in the US for an extensive period of time. When I go back to visit, particularly DC, the pace at which people move, that might be a little different from me personally, and not, as you put it, irking people who are in a rush, particularly around rush hour.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so continuing this conversation along, we want to focus in our discussion now, particularly on the US academic culture and setting. So we're going to speak a little bit about the academic calendar. And I'll just say that, for most of our students, it's going to follow the academic calendar to which you're accustomed, which is your fall semester is going to begin in about August to September and run until December. And then you'll have the spring semester that will begin in January and go until April, May. In some colleges and universities, they will have summer semesters or summer courses that are available to you. But the best way to get insight on that particular academic calendar and the grading scale associated with your school and your program is to go onto your institution's website in particular, and really familiarize yourself. I think one point that we want to underscore throughout this presentation is that your US academic institution is your resource center. That's really where you're going to want to go to understand, the calendar, the responsibilities, the grading scale, the expectations for you as a student on that campus. As it specifically relates to participation in class, Leland, what are some tips that you can give our students about participating in an American classroom?
Well, I think that in some universities overseas, my experience, for example, studying abroad in China, participation wasn't necessarily a big part of your grade, right? But in the US, participation is 15, 20, 25% of your grade. And so it's very important. I would say definitely in the United States, critical thinking, being able to actually debate with other students and put your input about a certain topic is absolutely crucial. So yeah, just like making sure to raise your hand if you definitely want to have something to say, and don't be shy. Definitely don't be shy. And yeah.
Yeah, I think a big point there is that it's not enough to show up sometimes in an American classroom. Mm-hmm. You have to come to class prepared to discuss what the assigned reading is, to share your perspective and your thoughts, and to be questioned. I think that is a notable difference sometimes that in particular, especially as you get into more focused classes, as you go through your degree program and your class size particularly maybe gets smaller. As you mentioned, critical thinking and being able to articulate your perspectives and your points of view is really important in an American classroom. So as I said, it's not enough sometimes to just show up. You have to have done the assigned reading and you have to come prepared to discuss that. And as you mentioned, attendance is sometimes taken into account in your grade. So again, one way that you would really be able to assess what is required of you as a student is when you get that syllabus at the start of the course, to thoroughly review that so that you know what the expectations are from the professor for you during the duration of that class. Now, the big point here that we do want to raise on US academic culture is looking at academic honesty. So Leland, can you share your insights on that?
It is not enough to sort of maybe print out something on Wikipedia and have that be your essay or your assignment. Plagiarism is a huge issue that is not tolerated at all in the university setting in the United States. So actually, a lot of the times when students are either taking an exam or about to hand in an assignment, they actually need to sign an agreement to say that, yes, like what they've done is their own academic work and that they did not plagiarize or sort of steal from other people's work.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and one that, I think it's notable to kind of conclude on as we begin to wrap up this presentation. The US does take plagiarism very seriously, as do many, university campuses globally, particularly now. And many US colleges and universities will have honor codes that when you sign on to become a student on that campus, you are signing on to that honor code. I know when I studied in the United States, every time I took an exam, I had to sign the honor code, which is self-regulating. You are making a promise that you have not plagiarized work, that you have not cheated, that you have behaved in an academically honest way. And there can be very serious repercussions for students who are academically dishonest, whether they cheat or plagiarize. And that's something that you do want to make yourself aware of when going into a US academic setting. With that being said, many of our students who are traveling to the United States have put in a lot of work to get there. So you want to keep that standard of work and improve on it. So that you are not just entering a US college or university, you are graduating, hopefully with honors from a US college or university. So I do think that's an important point to sort of close on. Yeah.
And if I might say just sort of two things, and actually pretty related to academic honesty and participation. You can cite other people. You can cite other people's sources. Hello? Can you guys?
Yes, we can still see you and hear you.
You can cite other people's sources, right, when you're doing your research, but it has to be well documented. And maybe the way that documentation happens in the U.S. is different from the way you document sources and whatnot in your own country, in which case it is imperative for you to go to some of these like writing, I would say clinics, I guess, or writing office hours. They always have that. I use that so often when I was in college. There would be office hours for people to basically get their essays read and proofread by peers or other students who are sort of a couple of years ahead, who might be able to tell you, oh, well, the grammar here isn't necessarily right, or you actually should have cited this source here, and this is the proper way to do it. I think it's absolutely important. Related to that and participation is sometimes, especially for the intro courses in universities, there are like hundreds of students And so you're thinking to yourself, well, how am I going to participate when there are literally hundreds of students and only one professor? And I think one of the ways to do that is to go to your professor's office hours. Every professor will have office hours, Monday and Thursday, or 3 times a week or 2 times a week. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of that not only to get a deeper sort of dive into the topic, but also to get to know your professor better, and to really show to the professor that you do care and that you are all in on the class.
Yeah, taking an interest, I think that's
Exactly.
wonderful. And I think there's sort of long-term benefits for that, whether that be, just showing your interest
Mm-hmm.
in the immediate sense for that class participation grade. But as you said, developing a relationship with a professor that could potentially become a mentor to you or a reference for you.
Absolutely.
That's an important point. And I think that's a great way to close. We've covered a lot today, Leland. I think we've skimmed the surface. And as mentioned, this is one of our first pre-departure themed sessions that we'll be having. Customarily, Education USA advisors dedicate sometimes a week of orientation sessions towards this topic of pre-departure to help students really prepare for what's to come culturally and academically. We will be hosting a series of sessions over the next few months designed for, sort of dedicated to this topic and to other topics that we think are of interest to students. At the start of this webinar, I sort of teased some upcoming virtual sessions that we're going to be having, one particularly on pathway programs. So I hope some of you guys were paying attention. So I'd like to know maybe, when is the next Education USA webinar? Are we having it on July 8th? Or are we having it on July 10th? Or are we having it on July 12th? When are we having this next Education USA webinar? Leland, do you remember?
I'm going to go July 8th.
You are right. And it's a catchy hashtag as well, hashtag Webinar Wednesday. Our webinar on July 8th is on pathway programs, and it will be hosted on Education USA Guatemala's Facebook page. As mentioned, we're having 3 universities come and discuss the pathway programs available through their institutions. So we do encourage you to join us for that. What we'd like to do now is take some of your questions that you may have for Leland as it relates to U.S. culture and values. I know we've been answering them throughout this presentation today, but if you have any more, please continue to submit them through the comments section, and we are happy to answer them. Thank you. I saw some people posted the correct answer coming up on the Are there any questions there, Leland? If not, I have a few.
No questions yet, but I want to thank Education USA Guatemala because they've already posted the link to their Facebook page. So when you guys are done with this program, definitely look to that link, and that will be the link for the Wednesday webinar.
Definitely. I think if I could ask you a question, Leland, and this is more of a personal question for you, maybe just reflecting back on when you transitioned from high school to college and university, what was the biggest change for you that you encountered, and how did you adjust to that transition?
I would say 100% time management. I think when you're in high school, you at least have your parents to sort of whip you into shape, right? And to say, well, no, yes, you're done with school, and then now after school, here's your time to do sports, and after sports, here's your time to do homework. But then for a lot of people, going to college is their very first time being absolutely alone and trying to figure out time management. And it's a really tough and steep transition. I would suggest that there are resources on college campuses in order to help with time management. There are either workshops or sort of people to help train other people on good time management. And prioritizing too is a really, really important thing. Like figuring out okay, well, what is due when? And sort of looking at the syllabus of all your classes at the very beginning to figure out, all right, which assignments are happening at which time, which times are they going to be happening at the same time, so that you can sort of plan ahead to know, oh my gosh, well, this week is going to be a really tough week. I might as well start planning to study early. So that was what I would say.
I think that's a critical point. And again, that's something that we're going to really be covering in some of our follow-up webinars. Mm-hmm. Time management is a huge responsibility for students who are going to begin their studies in the United States. Whether you're
Sorry, go ahead. I think you might be muted. Amanda?
Thank you.
Well,
sorry about that. I lost the connection there for a second. Technical difficulties.
Okay.
So with that being said, I do think that's an important point that we do want to raise for our students, is that it's really important to manage your time properly. You don't have parents or guardians there, or older siblings to sort of guide you along the way. It's the time that you're going to be personally responsible and have to take sort of authority of your finances, of your timetable, all of that stuff. I see a question coming in there. What was that question? The soft skills?
Yeah, so what soft skills did you develop in college?
Leland, what soft skills did you develop in college?
I would say sympathy, empathy for others. I know that a lot of people, you might feel like you're going through a lot. But then you realize that, man, other people either have a lot of classes, or they have other issues going on as well. And so to really be a friend, to listen to them, be a shoulder to cry on, to really sympathize with their situation, I think that's definitely a soft skill that I learned. Presentation, like having to give good presentations. So it's not only to write well, but if you can actually present your ideas in a way that's sort of cogent and will get people to really listen, is also another really important life skill.
Yeah, I think for me it was confidence, coming from being rather soft-spoken in previous settings and in classrooms where participation was not really that big of a requirement, or you could maybe hide more in a classroom. Becoming more confident in my speaking abilities and my opinions and my thoughts, and confident in sharing those and sharing my opinions in a classroom setting. That was really something that I gained from my experience in studying in the United States. It's not necessary that you're going to be right all the time, but sort of becoming more resilient as well. That was an important point. I think we'll ask just one more question before we wrap up this evening, Leland, if that's okay with you. I don't know if any questions came in, but I am...
There's one more. I'm interested, this is by Moni Haro. I'm interested in further understanding United States culture and values. Are there any books, documentaries, or websites you could recommend?
educationusa.state.gov. Put in a plug for that. And that, is half a joke answer. And you can talk about other sort of non-US government resources. But I do think educationusa.state.gov, our Education USA website, is a good first stop for many students who are preparing to depart, as well as the Education USA advising centers themselves. To get, we have tons of research and materials available through our advising centers and our advisors to really help guide you through this. And your U.S. embassies might be a good first stop as well.
Absolutely. I agree with Amanda 100%. If you're really interested in U.S. history and sort of using a cool way in order to learn some interesting things about our founding fathers, definitely watch Hamilton. Hamilton just came out on Disney Plus on July 3rd. It's awesome, absolutely amazing. And they want to learn about sort of the founding of the country in a really cool way. Definitely watch that.
Well, we'll make a plug for the fact that Hamilton was born in Nevis.
Yes, that's right.
Then transferred over to the United States. Right. I think, yes, there are sort of those entertaining sources that you could use. There are lots of documentaries available through PBS as well. I see something here. There's we're posting in the comment section there. Our REAC, Maria Mercedes Salmon, posted about some of the resources there. A great resource to learn more about the United States is actually the Smithsonian Museum. They have an amazing website. If you go on to the Smithsonian website to learn more about the different aspects about U.S. culture and history, that's an excellent resource as well to dive into, to look at that from a historical perspective. And that's one way when you actually get over there to really absorb the culture and the history of the state that you might be in, is to go and visit local museums when it's safe to do so, and when they're open to the public. Go in and take advantage of those cultural sites and resources, and familiarize yourself with the culture that way as well. Leland, I really want to thank you so much for joining us this evening for this conversation on U.S. culture and values. We appreciate your time in joining us. This is a region-wide effort. I really want to thank also the Education USA advisors who are working behind the scenes right now. Education USA Guatemala, our REACT Maria Mercedes Salmon, Education USA Nicaragua, El Salvador, Mexico, as well as Costa Rica. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's presentation, and stay tuned on Wednesday, July 8th at this same time for the presentation on pathway programs. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.